My dear friend Derrik Anderson is a special human being, and you know it when you meet him. Derrik instantly stands out in a room. He fills up a room. And it's not because of these things, but still, yet, I must tell you, he is a former professor at Johnson C. Smith. He is a brilliant facilitator of an extraordinary workshop here in Charlotte. Of course, he's executive director of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, where he collaborates with a group of 12 people, I think. It's a dozen people, including him. And you have judges, you have representatives of CMPD, CMS, just a unusually vibrant and provocative conversation that goes on with these folks, and he heads up that collaboration. He's also on the state board for juvenile services. But this is not why he's special. I mean, these things are something, but when you meet him, there's something about Derrik that I think Q really nailed. And if you were with us last week, you saw experienced rather the interview with Q, and I want to share with you what Q said about Derrik. He said, Derrik is a big man with a quiet power. He is a force, and his whispers have the strength of 1,000 horses. Don't you love that? You know, like me, Q knows that Derrik is a game changer, and he does it by speaking softly. And when he does, everybody in the room just leans in because it is so obvious that he knows exactly what we need to do to move forward. So welcome, Derrik, my friend.
Hi, Lou. Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. Those words are too kind. They're too kind.
Well,
and when I talk with Q tonight, I'm gonna let him know that he got me there. But thank you. I greatly appreciate that. I do, and thank you for the opportunity just to come and have a conversation on today. And welcome, and thank you everyone else who's joining in to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Well, you know that just it reeks of Q, does it not? That quote. I mean, that's him.
Yeah.
Well, Derrik,
Yeah,
just to
it
get
is.
us, yeah, I'm going to stop interrupting you here in a second. Just to get started, let's start at the very beginning. And if you would describe for us the problem, what don't many of us even know happens in terms of the inequity for outcomes as we look at those nonviolent and school-related offenses. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. I want to start out with a quote that just kind of centered me today from Brian Stevenson. Many of you all may know him with his movie Just Mercy, book Just Mercy, and his movie, but also the architect around the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. If you have not visited, it's a great opportunity to do so. But one of the quotes that he said is that the true measure of character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And so that centers me when we talk about the work that we do with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. And when you talk about youth or youth of color and equities within our system or school-based offense, when you look at the data, particular data from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, state data, it talks about when we look at youth detention centers for YDCs, for the 2018-2019 data, particularly for Mecklenburg County, the population of youth, Black youth made up only 35% of the youth population, yet they made up over 78% of the complaints filed against them. And also, if you look at the same data, when you look at the school-related complaints, African-American youth receive more complaints than any other race or ethnicity. And moreover, over half the complaints also when you look at across the state of North Carolina. When you think about over a 5-year trend, even though the number of youth who are being committed to the Youth Detention Center has decreased, in Mecklenburg County and across the state, African American males have the highest rates. And so when we believe in disaggregating data by race and gender, because once you disaggregate the data by race and gender, then you have to understand the story and lived experiences of youth and youth of color and people of color behind the data that's happening within systems and structures each and every day that some people may be aware of and others are not.
How would you describe the awareness level in general? If you were to, in speaking to this group, what do you find when you're out talking to a group that looks like this one? Do you find that people are surprised?
That's a great question, Lou. I'm finding that people are in different places and spaces, and respectively because of their socialization and lived experience. But also I'm finding that because people of color have been aware about the injustices that has happened and taken place, and either I think some of whites are coming into knowledge thereof with social media and all the things that's happening. And I think people now are seeing maybe something is wrong or something is happening. And so I think if we really don't understand the true history around our country and our systems and structures, it doesn't give us a true understanding around the things that we're seeing today. It doesn't help us to better understand the challenges we have in talking around race or dialoguing around race. Because there are so many statements that have been made that I'm colorblind or I don't see race or we all human or all lives matter. Without having a clear understanding about the true history and brutal history around race and racism in this country, we can't truly understand why there's such challenges, even today, talking about race and racism in a general conversation, without someone getting pitted in their values and beliefs or their emotions and beginning to justify one position or the other.
Absolutely. Well said. You know, Karen Geiger had a question for you, Derrik, asking if you have any data on who is doing the complaining.
With this particular data source for the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, what it talks about is that some of it was coming from schools, and it could be either school resource officers, sometimes has been a point of contact when you think about the school to prison pipeline. And so here in Mecklenburg County, we have the opportunity to work with the School and Justice Partnership, which is a relationship between the school system, the juvenile courts, Department of Juvenile Justice, and police department. And we've been meeting to talk about how we began to do, through a racial equity lens, look at our policy, procedures, and practices that are causing disparity and disproportionality. And how do we reduce the number of youth that are coming from the school to the juvenile courts. And over the course of time, we have seen some improvement. We've been able to, the police department have revised their policies as relates to school resource officers and gave another protocol in place. The school system has looked at their policies and procedures as relates to things that are done to make sure that they meet a certain threshold. If not, then it manages inside with the school policy with in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension versus a referral to the juvenile courts. And even when we look at our juvenile justice partners, they're beginning to look at their assessment tool. And before they receive a complaint, they begin to ask more questions and additional questions to make sure that for those youth who are coming into care and custody are the youth that need to be there. And there are also diversion programs that the school system have as well as the police department have. So I would say here with the relationships with some of our partner organizations, they're being intentional about reducing the number of youth that are being part of that school to prison pipeline.
Yeah. What about Derrik's personal story? What leads you to the work that you're doing here? I know you don't like this.
Oh, Lou.
I know. No.
I would say my personal story, one of the things I say is that I'm originally from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And if you know anything about the South, the Deep South, it's deep rooted within structural racism. It's deep rooted in hatred, bigotry, but there's also a lot of great people there as well. And so But some part of my journey, I say I grew up just in this work, just being an African American male with my own lived experiences. Anywhere from when I think about any city, any state that I lived in, when you're talking about being pulled over by the police, you know, anywhere from as a teen throughout as an adult, or if you're talking about being followed in stores, or if you question about why you're in neighborhoods or communities, or even today, as I do this work, I've been told by people that when I show up in a shirt and tie, that when I have this conversation and we get into this dialogue, and then you have people to say to me, well, Derrik, if people like you show up dressed like you, then nothing will happen to them. So what do you really say about the values and views of people of color, or even me, right? Or if you think about the fear that I have even today of having a son who's about to start driving, even though he's excited to be 14 and want to get his permit, and looking through that, I'm fearful because I know there's something on the other side that he has no knowledge of. I'm fearful that I'm not protected because it has nothing to do with my job, my position, my status, my academic attainment, simply as a Black male, being in the wrong place at the wrong time or in interface with the wrong people. And so even now, when you look at things that are happening across social media of people, of Black men and women who are situated differently, but still, because of this deep-rooted history in terms of people being fearful of us, is that we don't get the benefit of the doubt. We don't get the benefit of the doubt in schools. We don't get the benefit of the doubt in systems and institutions and communities. And even for myself, I'm very mindful where I go, how I walk, where I go, where I'm driving. I'm very mindful about my intentions. And so, but one of the things that I was facilitating the conversation, and they asked the question, what is it that you can say to people or tell people not to get shot by police? And I said that the only thing that I believe is that we, as men of color, have to make sure that any officer, regardless of their race or gender, feels safe and comfortable so they go home in order for us to go home, right? Mm-hmm. And so think about that. We have to be mindful that we have to ensure the safety of the officer's safety to go home, and even for us to go home. And so I think just living with that, but I'm hopeful. I'm inspired by this work. This work is what I do, not just personally, but professionally. Any groups I serve, any places that I volunteer, one of the things I truly believe is that this work is really around the hearts and mind of people. One of the co-founders and clerk of Race Matters Juvenile Justice, Elisa Chingari, says, how you see people is how you serve people. Yeah. How you see people is how you serve people. And one of the things I often say is that not all white people are bad, just like not all Black people are good. It's really around the heart and mind of people. And I've met a lot of whites who are great. And I've met a lot of Blacks who are great. And I've met a lot of people who want the best for most people and all people. But we have to also acknowledge and understand that we're situated differently simply because of our skin color, but more importantly, because of the history of our country and how it sits and embedded within systems and institutions as it relates to the culture of those systems and institutions.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about the workshop that hundreds, I think a couple of thousand people actually have been through, that is so celebrated. I know due to COVID, it's not happening at the moment, but did you begin as a facilitator of that workshop before you became executive director? Tell us about that.
Yes, great question. I joined the leadership team of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice in 2011, and I attended my first workshop in January 2012 with most of the leadership team members that are even there today now. But RMJJ was established in 2010. And when we attended our workshop, and we partnered with the Racial Equity Institute out of Greensboro, North Carolina, and they're the ones who facilitate our workshop. We hosted, but they facilitated. And we've been in relationship with them since then. But as of today, we have hosted 149 workshops and 4,685 people have participated here. And so one of the greatest things I say is not just about the workshop. The workshop, I like to say, is a two-day experience that elevates your social awareness about disparities and disproportionalities that happen across all systems and institutions each and every day that some people may be aware of and others are not. The workshop is the entry point into the work of RMJJ. And once you go through the two-day workshop, Then you then had the opportunity to participate as a part of our 6 subcommittees and then work groups. And then is an opportunity to volunteer to look at how you can support the work that we do with RMJJ. In addition to that, we have hosted 3 conferences, biannual conferences that we host every other year. That's open to not only racial equity alums, but also the general public and our partners. Because one of the things we really focus on as the primary goal for RMJJ is really we're system organizers, which means we believe in naming white supremacy, naming institutional and structural racism, but more importantly, we focus on the inequities that's embedded in policies, procedures, and practices that's causing disparity and disproportionality. We believe that if you don't really label it and call it out, it continues to hide, and it hides in systems because we don't name it. And if we're not able to name structural racism, then we can't see it. And more importantly, what do we do about it? And we have to address the policies, procedure, and practices that cause it. And so part of what we do through our practice change guidelines is work with system leaders and organizations to look at their policies. And how do we look at it through a racial equity lens to begin to ensure that we're really trying to make things more equitable in a transformational way?
Yeah. These are really extraordinary times that we're going through, Derrik. How do you see this time and space that is ours to move upon? What do you see in the context of this enormous backdrop of awareness? What do you see for RMJJ?
I continue to see our work as ever present, is ever important. One of the things that I've shared with people who've asked me, what is RMJJ doing in the midst of this? I said, RMJJ is doing what we've been doing since the day one of our mission and vision. We continue to look at how we work with systems and system leaders to address disparity and disproportionality. But more important, I believe that we have to continue to share the message to help people to understand the root cause of what we're witnessing and experiencing is structural racism. We have to understand that it's deeply rooted in white supremacy when you talk about a political and socioeconomic system where white people enjoy structural advantages and rights that other racial and ethnic groups do not. Racism has crippled our nation for over 400 years. As a violence and injustice terrorizes people of color, few are held accountable within systems and institutions that have taken an oath to serve and protect all citizens. And so as we think about this, we have to look at how we can stay focused, stay engaged, but more importantly, we need more people to join us in this effort and work to really do the work collectively.
Where do you draw your inspiration from? This is a daunting charge that you have. It has to be overwhelming sometimes.
It is. It is. I would not tell you that it's not. And to be quite honest with you, about several weeks ago, when a lot of the protests broke out, not just here, but across the country, I had trouble sleeping in that night. And so I woke up early that morning and I picked up my phone and I just started to download just my thoughts, my feelings, my emotions, and my experiences. And when I finished, I emailed it to myself. I cut and pasted to a Word document, and I had about 3.5 to 4 pages of stuff. Shared the information with my wife, and she began to cry because she said, I had no idea that you was holding, dealing with that. And in the midst of that conversation, I also talked about anytime I hear about an unarmed Black man being shot and killed by law enforcement, it reminds me of July the 3rd, 1998 at 6:00 p.m. When that could have been me, and I was pulled over, and my wife, who I was dating at the time, was in the car. And so when you think about that situation, even with the officer putting his hand on his gun and the threatening movements of what's taking place then, but guess what? Had I been shot or killed that day, I wouldn't be here talking to you. There would be no videotape. There would be no camera. And so when you think about the lived experiences that people of color have, you only see what's videoed. You don't see what's not happening. And when you think about just not only situations, but myself and my family and friends that we continue to talk about and look at what we need to do to survive and what is good enough for whites, that's okay for blacks. What's good enough that we can't be harmed, intentionally or unintentionally. And I don't know the answer. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I'm even more committed, because what I've said is that I owe a debt of gratitude to those who come before me, both whites and people of color who have labored and shared blood for this particular cause. I'm hopeful because I believe that in a greater, better generation for my kids, my grandkids and great grandkids, I believe that I have to look at what I can do to pay it forward and not use the distraction of saying what other people can do. I look at how I can change my implicit bias. How do I look at my blind spots? How am I making sure that I'm not causing harm to anybody, regardless of their race or gender? I think the work starts with me. The work starts with me looking at changing my mental model. How do I make sure that as a gatekeeper or as a power broker that I'm using to make good for, regardless of people around their race and gender? And so I believe the change starts with us, but it changes starting our mental model. It really around how do we adapt our values and views? How do we change our values and beliefs about how we see people and how we serve people? And it starts with us. This work that we are do is really hard work, and it's at the root of the heart and mind. And what I'm so happy and grateful for is that I have a leadership team of partner organizations that are committed, but they are good people working inside of systems and structures that was not designed for people of color. And it's hard. And this is emotional labor. This work is emotional labor. But I'm grateful because I have people that are committed. I am grateful because we have a group of people internally, externally, that we can connect with, that we can talk, that we can dialogue, that we can share our pains, our joys, but also people that we are on our individual and collective journey together. And that's what's so wonderful about this work that we're embarking upon.
Well, what Derrik, is the most important thing that Charlotte can do at this moment, and what can we do at this moment?
That's a great question. And I continue to wrestle with that because I have two different distinctions. The one distinction is that I'm hopeful about great things to come. But at the same time, when I continue to see images of people of color continue to be harmed, intentional, unintentional, when I continue to read news articles where people are falsely accusing people of color for certain things, when I continue to hear about the lynchings of Black men that took place in Texas or California, and you blame it as suicide. When you hear what took place in Wilmington, about the news report just came out regarding their police department, in terms of what officers have said, not only about some of the community members who are Black, but also about their own Black officers. And this was coming from white officers. So in the midst of all these things, we have to acknowledge the honest and brutal truth about these things that are happening in systems and structures, and we have to name it and call it out. But I also believe that it's important that if we really want to move toward racial equity, then we must lead with race. We have to disaggregate our data by race and gender to see what the data says, and then really be explicit about motivating and centering ourselves really around equity. We have to center ourselves in terms of equity and how we can be intentional about interrupt systems and institutions. And as we're centering equity, we have to also look at how do we address policy, procedures, and practices that are causing disparity and disproportionality. I also think that when we talk about the wealth disparity that's taking place, for those who have access to resources, how do you share power? So when we think about our white colleagues and allies and co-conspirators who are really interested in equity, how are you sharing power? How are you using your influence, your social capital, your resources to benefit people of color, to benefit business of color? How do you begin to look at in places and spaces that you go in, whether it's family meetings or events, whether they're friend meetings? How do you hear, when you hear things about people of color or anybody that you may not hold to be true, do you have the courage to speak against it? When I talk about this work starting with us, It started with us changing our mental model to say, do we have the bravery and courage to stand up to things that are said about people that are not accurate or true, even as our friends or our families? Or what are we willing to sacrifice for others if it's really around being allies in this work? The other thing I mentioned is around I statements. I believe using I statements because when Derrik says what somebody else needs to do, that becomes a distraction. It becomes a distraction because the focus on what other people need to do versus what I need to do. And so that's why I said I focus on my mental model. I focus on my values and beliefs. I focus on my implicit bias. I focus on my blind spots. I focus on making sure that I'm not causing harm to anybody regardless of their race or gender. But more importantly, I think that we have to look at how we can continue to go through emotional labor together. This emotional labor, how do you begin to connect and listen to understand and live the experience of people of color and giving them the benefit of doubt? But more importantly, how do we be curious learners of each other, regardless of our background, regardless of our race, regardless of our gender? That's just as people, how do we begin to learn from one another and giving them the benefit of doubt? And if it's something that they said that that we don't agree with, how do we ask another question to get clarification or more information as a way to continue to learn about one another as we do this work? And so I think it's all of that and more, but it starts with us.
Wow. What Q said about you being a force, I think everybody on this call is going to agree with. You know, the amazing thing about you, Derrik, is I see you, you will move from a seated position of being very quiet into the force that we just saw. And it's always a blessing. It's just a blessing to be a part of it. And it's a profound, I feel like I have to sit for a while because you've taken us to church and I have to be with these thoughts. I wish that the download of your thoughts that you cut and pasted were available somewhere. Are they not? Is that private?
It's private.
Okay.
It was part of my personal self-reflections, part of my history, part of my journey, it's part of my story. And I think another thing that we can continue to do is to read. We can read books, read articles, look at documentaries, continue to learn about the history of our country, continue to learn about the history of different races. One of the things that we get pitted in race about black and white. But what about our Native American brothers and sisters? What about our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Asian American brothers and sisters? And so they're the voices of other people who are not a part of this discussion around race and racism. But we have to be intentional about including other perspectives. We have to be intentional about including other race and ethnic groups. And we have to be intentional about dismantling systems and institutions that is causing harm to people of color, intentional or unintentional.
Yeah. Well, Derrik Anderson, on behalf of this group here, let me tell you that I am so grateful that you do what you do and that you have inspired us today. I genuinely see that you make change happen even in your communication. I mean, I feel changed by you, and your communication is transformational. So thank you for being with us today. I know how crazy busy you are. You know I adore you. And I did say that if we get questions that lag behind I keep seeing the chat move, that come after 11:30, I would love to get those to you and just record you answering those. But with that, thank you.